authenticity to Trump. You're the boss. It's sad. It's sad.
It's been just over a year from one of the darkest days recently in America, and we've seen plenty of those these past few years. January 6th, 2021 saw thousands of citizens descend upon the Capitol in efforts to support an outgoing president and maybe even witness the unimaginable, the overturn of an American election. Most were peaceful, many others not so much. History of these events is usually viewed by the victor. This would either be the catalyst of a revolution or the quelling of an insurrection. So what was it? Revolution or insurrection? I can tell you what it wasn't. It wasn't a bunch of tourists strolling through the Capitol peacefully, that's for sure. It all boils down to the 2020 presidential election. Then former Vice President Biden defeated the incumbent President Trump in what would launch a flurry of allegations of election fraud. Trying to absorb that amount of information was like drinking from a fire hose. And if all of these accusations of fraud were true, then those who did act on January 6th could have a legitimate excuse. And something of that egregious nature should absolutely have serious inquiry. So before we can decipher the insurrection question, was there widespread fraud in the 2020 election? President Trump would like you to believe so. Going as far back as the 2016 presidential campaign, he started planting the seeds of voter fraud early in connection to Russia. And when he won in 2016, those allegations were actually investigated. The Voting Integrity Commission was formed soon after Trump took office. It was headed by Vice President Pence, and after all efforts were exhausted, they found zero evidence of widespread voter fraud. Don't get me wrong, there are deceptive people out there who do engage in illegal voting activity, but it is minuscule and isolated, and it has never impacted the results of any election, and most are identified and prosecuted. 4 years later, Trump embarked on the same tactic, planting the seeds of doubt before there was ever any evidence to support his allegations. And with the expected increase in mail-in ballots, he was able to drive an aura of distrust on this process and prey on those who already applied a negative connotation to those mail-in and absentee ballots. But how secure are mail-in ballots, and are they easily manipulated? Well, we use the Postal Service for numerous and important transactions, such as paying taxes, receiving relief checks, VA medications, and even renewing our identification. So it seems we trust the Postal Service enough with these things that directly affect us. So the post office itself, it can be ruled out as a fraudulent source. And what about the ballots themselves? Well, every single state requires signature verification, and you are required to be registered to vote. And they have to have a signature on file, normally from a driver's license or a state ID, all of which are legal documents, in order to match ballot signatures. Sure, you can forge a signature, but in order to forge the amount of signatures to overturn an election, it would take an enormous amount of effort and manpower. And that's where things would fall apart. The more people involved, the less likely there is to keep a secret. No one has come forward so far, and there has been no evidence discovered of this occurring. The next concern would be the so-called ballot dumps. We did see them pulling suitcases full of ballots from under a table in Georgia, except we didn't. Giuliani was more concerned with his hair color than the truth. The video, touted all over the internet, was heavily edited and promoted with immoral intent. The video, in its entirety, shows proper handling of ballots, official stowage of ballots, and appropriate oversight of those ballots. It has been thoroughly debunked, along with people scanning single ballots multiple times. In those cases, they were simply errors reading the ballot, but each ballot has a barcode and can only be counted once, regardless of how many times you actually scan it. The voting machines are offline and rarely susceptible to remote hacking, and they are inspected by independent observers before and after use. They have been highly examined since, with no findings of tampering. This is why we're seeing defamation lawsuits against news stations that repeatedly reported that these machines were suspect. Well, if mail-in ballots are secure, which they are, and voting machines are safe, which they've proven to be, how is there such huge ballot dumps in the middle of election night that swung the favor to Biden when Trump was steadily leading for most of the day? Well, it makes sense if you really think about it. In states that allow counting and prep work before Election Day for mail-in ballots like Florida and Texas, Biden jumped out to a huge and surprising lead. Sure, Florida is always in play for either party, but Texas has been a pretty deep red state for a while, so it was a shock to some that he was leading early in the day. But this should have been an indicator to the amount of support nationwide Biden was obtaining through mail-in ballots. And as in-person ballots were cast in Texas and Florida, the lead swung back to Trump. This is exactly the opposite of what happened in states like Georgia, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where in-person voting were counted early, which favored Trump, and then mail-ins were counted later that swung in Biden's favor. This has been historically referred to as the red or blue mirage. There have been numerous other accusations of fraud as well, or even outlandish claims like watermark ballots, but all have had legitimate explanation or have been debunked, and none with nefarious intent. Many have been taken to court with denials, dropped cases, and rulings against Trump-supporting claims. So, in all, the election wasn't stolen, and there is actual evidence to support that. Regardless of claims, speculation, coincidence, or circumstantial data for widespread election fraud, there is no tangible or valid evidence to support what is known as the steal. And President Trump and his campaign team were cunning in developing this tactic, and by all indicators, successful in its implementation. By casting doubt on mail-in ballots, he was able to maneuver the Republican base to, one, vote in person, which amplified the red mirage, and two, distrust the authenticity of mail-in ballots in the case of a loss, which, as we see, has come to fruition. And using those two narratives, he and his team were able to garner support in dissension of the election results leading up to Inauguration Day. But the fact is, COVID prompted more states to adopt mail-in voting. And they took the same criteria required of absentee ballots, such as legal citizenship. Absentee voting has a secure and long history in America, and were normally cast by our service members dating all the way back to the Civil War without issue. This alone encouraged the largest turnout for a presidential election in our history. Not only did Biden receive more votes than anyone, but Trump also received an incredible increase in votes as well. This is a huge win for democracy, as every legal citizen should have their voice heard, be it in person or absentee, because if it's good enough for our military, it's good enough for our citizens. So back to January 6th. Because there wasn't legitimate, verifiable evidence to support a fraudulent election, then there was no grounds for a revolution. So, By definition, it can be considered an insurrection. Though I tend to believe that many were just impassioned, confused, and swept up in a mob mentality, and not necessarily trying to overturn the government, but dissatisfied with the election results and wanted some semblance of gratification. And no, it was not an FBI or Antifa operation. If you think that, you're giving them way too much credit. It was literally just a bunch of passionate Americans that couldn't accept defeat. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't maintain a healthy level of skepticism towards our government. And we should scrutinize and hold accountable all of our elected officials. And we should support the January 6th Commission because it sets a precedent for all future presidents, regardless of party affiliation. It was Hillary Clinton's inaction and the 4 American deaths at Benghazi that triggered a commission in 2014. At least she had the balls to face her accusation panel. And even though that panel found no illegal action on her part, it was her complacency during Benghazi, among others, that provoked me in voting against her and for Trump in 2016. I'm sorry. I was still trapped in the lesser of two evils mentality, but I've learned. January 6th, 2021 was the culmination of emotion, manipulation, partisanship, and division. After a year of quarantines, riots, police brutality, job loss, and COVID deaths, many were at their emotional and logical breaking point. Disbelief led to action, and those actions were an attack on our capital. 5 Americans died, one more than Benghazi. We deserve to know what our elected officials were doing during that dark day, just as we did then with Benghazi. It's the only way to reestablish trust in our democracy.